In 1771, Banks was still a young man. Indeed, an unusually young man for his age. He had spent 3 of his 28 years shut up in a small bark with little in the way of ordinary social intercourse, and much of his time between 14 and 25 had been devoted to botany. When Dr. Johnson, some while after this, said to Mrs. Thrale, "You may remember I thought Banks had not gained much by circumnavigating the world," he may very well have meant not gained much skill in dealing with people, particularly his equals and superiors, not much notion of how other people saw him, not much perception of what was and what was not possible in a complex society. It is, after all, a matter of common observation that going through a war does not necessarily fit men for ordinary life, nor, however horrible their experiences, does it necessarily cause them to grow up. And the Endeavor's voyage, with its discomfort, short commons, long stretches of doing nothing, and moments of extreme danger, was not at all unlike a war. Hello, and welcome back to the History of Fresh Produce, everyone. And that passage I just read came from Patrick O'Brien's fabulous book, Joseph Banks, A Life, which really is a properly titled book, Patrick, I think. And I thought that this passage really captured the impression that people, well, at least some people had of Banks when he returned from his epic voyage around the world. So, to remind listeners, in the last episode, we left Joseph Banks stepping off the Endeavor and into something far more intoxicating than Tahitian breadfruit or New Zealand flax. And that, of course, is fame. And he just came back from circumnavigating the globe. He returned with botanical wonders that Britain had really never seen before, and suddenly just found himself at the very center of scientific life in London. And
Yep.
so today's episode is about what happens when success goes to your head, right? That's
We've all seen it.
yeah, we've all seen it.
Yeah, we have.
That's something that does not diminish with time,
No.
and history standpoint. Because again, within weeks of coming home, Banks was no longer simply a brilliant young naturalist, right? He was a celebrity. He was a fixer. He was a man with the king's ear. The newspapers, the
Yep.
press, right, are at his feet. And as we'll see in due course, an absolutely colossal sense of his own importance, as was sort of illustrated in that opening passage I just read. And that matters because this is the moment when Banks begins to shape not just botany, but the future of global agriculture and
Yes.
produce. Who collects it, who controls it, and where it flows.
And he's still only 28, right, John? So which always, feels important to say, right? Like, age there's always a good time to tell age, right?
Yeah, I mean, and if there's one person to keep reminding how old they are, it's Banks in this story. I mean,
Right?
it's just incredible. So yeah, 28. He's rich. He's adored at this point, and convinced that the future of science, rather obviously, revolves around him. He is
Right.
the center of the world in his mind at this point.
Makes
So
sense.
today we're going to watch Banks plan a second great voyage to the South Seas, bigger, better, and very much his now, and see how that ambition begins to collide with reality. And when that happens, things are going to get uh, pretty tense, I will say. So let's dive into it because there's a lot to cover in today's episode. So, in the months after the Endeavor returned, Joseph Banks seemed to forget one small but rather important detail. He had not been in command of the ship, right? Remember, James Cook, that big, blunt Yorkshireman, he's the one that captained the voyage. He's the one that navigated through the storms, the reefs, disaster, and brought, you know, with the exception of those that died, everyone else home alive. Banks, for all his brilliance, had been just a mere paying passenger, a rich one at that, but still a passenger. But success has a way of rewriting memories, especially your own. And so Banks had helped Cook get promoted when he came back. He helped introduce him to royalty. But in Banks's mind, Cook was still essentially hired help. Useful, yes, of course, but a subordinate to himself. And if Banks were going to sail again, then Cook would need to understand something very clearly. The scientist was now, as Banks put it, quote, the director and conductor of the whole.
which is quite a thing. Okay. And think about it when you're not technically in the Navy,
No, I mean he has no affiliation with the Navy. I mean, he has some friends in the Navy, of course, but that's not the same thing as knowing about how to sail a boat, right?
right?
But the thing is, I mean, he was people are treating him as if it were true. Again, because at this point, he's a celebrity, right? So a second voyage to the South Seas had been buzzing almost from the moment the Endeavour docked. They want to know what's the next big thing that to come. And so the
Yep.
Admiralty, stung by criticism after Cook had run the ship onto the Great Barrier Reef, which we heard in the prior episode, with really no, there was no backup in sight. There was no other ships around at this time. They were already considering sending two ships the next time for safety, redundancy, if you will. And so Alexander Dalrymple, Cook's old rival, had been particularly scathing about the whole affair. And so quietly at first, the Navy sounded Cook out. Would he go again? Would he command two vessels? But the newspapers, they were at it already. The story was already being written, and it wasn't Cook's voyage. According to the press, this was going to be Banks's expedition. And so you have the Gazetter and the New Daily Advertiser that announced that, quote, Mr. Banks is to have two ships from government to pursue his discoveries in the South Seas and will sail upon his second voyage next March. And then the Westminster Journal actually went one better, and they breathlessly reported that there would be three ships and that the, quote, celebrated Mr. Banks would carry men, arms, and provisions to the South Pacific in order to plant and settle a colony.
Wow. Well, that escalate. Yeah, I was going to say that escalated very, very quickly from science to empire, right?
Yeah, now we're talking about colonies. Now
Yeah,
they're
this was
thinking like
that got pretty fast. That
yeah,
escalated really quick.
little imperial action. So, and Banks, of course, is not going to discourage any of that. That sounds wonderful. Leading an expedition of this kind of size. And
Yeah.
he later recalled that soon after returning, his old pal, Lord Sandwich, so again, listeners will remember him from a
Yep.
couple episodes back. He is at this point the first Lord of the Admiralty. He approached him directly and said, in effect, if you go, we'll send other ships. Yeah, we got your back.
Gotcha.
And Banks admitted that this was precisely what he wanted to hear. Yeah. this, so unsurprisingly, he agreed immediately to say, yeah, of course, no problem, I'll go. And so the Navy board was instructed to find suitable vessels. And before long, Banks was informed that two ships were going to be prepared for his next great adventure.
Imagine having two ships built just for you, right?
Yeah, that's
Like,
not a bad
wow.
deal.
We have to purchase cars. They're not built just for maybe some are for some
Well, I was
people,
gonna say, if
but
you have enough money, right?
yeah, I don't yeah, no, okay. Well, meanwhile, now back in London, everyone, his house on New Burlington Street was turning into something like the nerve center of enlightenment science, wasn't it, John?
Yeah, yeah, it was.
Letters poured in English, French, Latin, from England, France, Holland, Switzerland, Germany. Sailors wrote knowing Cook had been in charge, but also knowing that Banks was the man with the money, the influence, and the connections to get them onto the next voyage. Okay. Scholars sent congratulations. Natural philosophers sent advice. Everyone had questions. What birds did he find? What animals? What minerals? What chemicals? He studied the diet and diseases of indigenous people, right? The questions that were asked, what about volcanoes? Shellfish? Like, think about it, John. And which globes and maps did he think were most accurate?
Yeah.
Everybody was looking to him for these, answers to questions. One correspondent even asked if he might be so kind as to bring back a quart or two of seawater from different latitudes.
Which is just, yeah, it's very enlightenment, right? I mean, just bring us back the ocean, please.
Just bring us back
That's
bring the ocean back, please. You want the moon? I'll give you the moon, okay? It's exactly right. I mean, catalog the world, bottle it up, label it, bring it home. And crucially for our story, this wasn't abstract curiosity. This was about plants, about crops, about fresh produce that might be transplanted, right? Commercialized and reshaped to Britain's expanding empire. So, again, as you said, John, on the 25th of September of 1771, just 2 months After the Endeavour arrived home, uh, the Admiralty formally instructed the Navy board to buy 2 ships for another voyage south. So we got another one. So I'm sure there's one question, John, that all our listeners are begging to know the answer to is what kind of ships?
Of course, everybody wants to know kind of ships, right? We have nautical experts on this
Yeah, well,
on
Cook
this channel.
recommended what he knew, sturdy, Whitby-built cats made by Thomas Fishburne, the same man who built the Endeavour, and that's exactly what they went with. The vessels were purchased, renamed again, and eventually becoming HMS Resolution and HMS Adventure. Cook would command the Resolution. Tobias Fernu would take the Adventure, and Banks turned his attention to building what can only describe as a floating scientific empire. He planned an expanded support staff of at least 16,
Oh,
John,
that's it.
sparing absolutely no expense. Solander would come again, of course. There
Of
would
course.
be 4 artists devoted solely to natural history, each paid £100 a year. Among them was Johann Zoffany, a celebrated portrait painter, possibly included as a kind of personal reward. And apparently, he may have painted Banks when he was a student at Eton, too. So,
Yeah, always useful, I imagine, to have someone on hand to paint you heroically, right? I mean, you when you travel, you bring an entourage, right? Got a little
always
painter
bring
in the
someone
corner.
who could paint you
Yeah, that's critical.
or someone with a camera, right?
Yeah, well, man.
I guess he's got a point.
You got someone with a camera always around you. See?
I do, but not 16 deep.
No. Well, eventually you might.
16 now. That's six. If I'm 16 deep, we got an issue. Okay. That means there's a problem. But Banks certainly thought so. Okay. And Zoffany, it turns out, was also astonishingly hard to kill. Okay.
Okay.
Years later, surviving a shipwreck where the survivors literally drew lots over who would be eaten.
Okay.
Banks also hired secretaries. He hired servants, 9 of them, trained personally by him to collect, preserve, and catalog specimens. He even brought along 2 French horn players to keep himself entertained.
That you
Yes,
definitely have to bring with you.
I'm gonna start bringing a mariachi band everywhere I go, okay? Everyone had a wage. Everyone had a role. Everyone, John, it seems, orbited Banks. He invited Joseph Priestley, inventor of fizzy water and soon to be discovered oxygen.
Mm,
But the board of longitude rejected him on religious grounds. Still, astronomers came. And most importantly, for the history of fresh produce and naval health, Banks secured James Lind, the man
oh,
who demonstrated that citrus fruit cured scurvy.
he's back.
This was science with consequences, everyone. This was botany tied directly to survival, trade, and empire. Now, Solander estimated that Banks now had a disposable income of between 8 and 10,000 pounds a year. He was spending a huge slice of it too. He bought everything imaginable: tents, microscopes, harpoons, pistols, magic lanterns,
Ooh, magic lantern.
beads and mirrors, for gifts and fish hooks, insect catchers, charts, sextants, metals. I mean, the list could go on. Probably feathers, silk. Geez, think about it. Even tools, caskets of nails, right? Which Tahitian women, if listeners remember from the last couple of episodes, adored as well. Remember that.
Yes, we do remember that, right? And I mean, like you said, there's a lot in that list. Just
There's a
it's a
lot.
kind of shopping list that suggests absolutely that no one ever said no to this man Banks. I mean, he just yeah, he's just ordering everything he basically sees, and I mean, he can. He's
Yeah,
got
I
the
mean, and
money.
maybe
He's got the
that's the
funding.
point, right? Maybe
Yeah.
that is just the key point because at 28, Banks was drowning in his own self-importance. He didn't even reply to Lanews after, for months, driving the old professor half mad with worry that the precious specimens might be decaying away somewhere, eaten by insects. Banks explained rather grandly that his preparations for the new voyage had swelled to a preposterous size. In other words, he was too busy to take his calls.
Ouch.
Yeah.
That's
He
harsh.
did find time to commission not 1, but 2 heroic portraits of himself from arguably 2 of the world's greatest artists at the time, Benjamin West and Joshua Reynolds. And these portraits were larger than life, quite literally, John. Okay. So everything was falling into place: the ships, the money, the staff, the glory. And yet, there was one small group of people who had not entirely agreed to this vision that Banks had, okay? As supreme commander, which of sciences and sea alike, they did not want it, okay? They didn't agree with that. And when Banks finally realized that his plans were not being approved in quite the way he expected, well,
Mhm.
that's when the tantrum began.
That's right. So,
Nice tantrum.
but before we get to that tantrum, because it is quite the tantrum, let's ask why Banks even wants to do the second voyage in the first place. I mean, we know about the celebrity and stuff. We know about the glory and all the stuff that comes with it as he experienced in the first voyage. But there's
Yeah.
something more here. So, in his own words, the aim of this new mission was nothing less than to, quote, reverse our last track, keeping to the eastward from the Cape by Van Diemen's Land and New Holland, and then sail towards the South Pole to see whether that immense portion of our globe is
Yep.
land or water. So basically, he's still fixated on finding that big southern continent, which we know today as Antarctica. That's eating away at him.
I mean, true. But knowing Banks, he surely also has an eye on plants,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
He saw on the Endeavor, and we saw this on the Endeavor expedition. Wherever the ship goes, there are seeds to collect, specimens, right, to ship back, landscapes to catalog, right, John?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, plants are definitely not going away from his mind. And this isn't just adventure for adventure's sake. This is about remaking Britain's relationship with the natural world. So, like we've kind of been saying throughout all these episodes at this point, new crops, new timbers, new foods, new medicines. But here's the problem, right? The
Yep.
Admiralty had already decided what ship would take them south, the Resolution. And Cook, of course, thought she was perfect. I mean, after all, he was
Yeah.
kind of the one that kind of recommended this. It was tough. These were proven seaworthy ships. But Banks did not.
I mean, Banks, it turns out, had opinions about ship design.
Ve Very
Tell
strong
us,
opinions.
Banks.
Yeah, tell us what you think. Well, I'll tell you what he thought. So he told Lord Sandwich flatly that the collier was neither comfortable nor commodious enough for him and his entourage. Remember, it's like 16 people with some French horn players, and God knows what else. So he wanted something bigger. Okay, that wasn't big enough. Ideally on his wish list, he wanted a warship or a vast East India man, which is these
Okay.
enormous vessels. And if he didn't get it, then the resolution would need extensive alterations. So, and his line ends up being pretty stark. He says, if the alterations which I proposed could not be made, I would not go. Now, this is an extraordinary thing to say. Okay, he's not a naval officer. He has no idea what he's talking about in terms of a
It
boat
sounds like he
or
does.
he's never commanded a ship, but he's Joseph Banks, and he's used to being indulged.
Oh my gosh. And indulge, I would say he very, very much was.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so Hugh Palliser, so Cook's old mentor and now comptroller of the Navy Board, was just horrified by Banks's audacity. But Sandwich, his buddy and protector here, allowed him to submit these detailed demands about the quote quantity of room that he thought was absolutely necessary on this ship. So the shipyards went to work and work some more. And March comes and goes. The bill for all these modifications passed £10,000, which is just an eye-watering sum. And it's all being footed by the government, by the way. And so shipwrights raised the upper deck to give Banks's men more space. Cook is forced to give up his great cabin entirely. Banks takes it for himself, and Cook gets this little small extra cabin that's tacked on almost as an as an afterthought. And remember, Cook is supposed to be the captain.
So Banks has effectively turned Cook's ship into his own floating botanical palace. I mean, once again, right?
Yeah, it just I mean that's exactly how he saw it. Is essentially is his own personal palace. Now, when Sandwich came down to inspect the renovations, Banks ends up throwing a party on board. This is his
Of
pride and joy
course.
at this point. So
Of
Sandwich was
course.
there, the French ambassador was there, assorted dignitaries all sipping wine on deck. And Cook later recorded how Banks entertained them all, holding court aboard what he now regarded as his ship. And Patrick, there was also actually a 13-year-old on board named John Elliott who watched all this just open mouth disbelief. He later wrote that a quote a more proud, haughty man could not well be, and that all Banks's plans basically seemed designed to show his own greatness.
Hmm. Kids are always the most brutal witnesses, huh?
They are. Oh, we got kids. We know.
Oh,
There's
trust
no
me.
filter there. They'll let you know what they think.
They'll be like, "Hey, do you remember when?" We'll be like, "Oh man, how do you remember that?"
Yeah. So they're around still in the 1700s. So not long after this display, Resolution now goes down the river for sea trials because that's standard.
Yep.
I got to test out. It's like taking a test drive on your new car, right? So first the vessel goes to Long Reach, then out to the Downs off the Kent coast, and here reality intervened. So Palliser's fears were confirmed. Even with guns and ballast, the ship was now dangerously top heavy. So in a strong wind, she would just very likely capsize. And so the pilot flatly refused to take her past the Nore. He's like, "That's it. I am, I'm not going to be responsible for this ship capsizing." So Cook, who had bent over backwards to accommodate Banks, horn players and all, was firm. The ship had to be returned closer to her original configuration, and then Navy board, of course, agreed. The facts don't lie. Of course, our friend Banks did not agree.
Yeah, let me guess. This goes badly, huh? Very badly,
Yeah, it's like taking a toy away from a kid, right? I mean, this
right?
guy
I
just
was gonna
thought
say,
like
like, it's about
like,
to
"This
go
is my
down.
my special customized toy that I just made, and you're gonna
Why
tell
would
me I
you
can't
do
play with it
that?
anymore." So, yeah, I mean, this is a spectacular, fallout and tantrum. So, basically, the proposed changes were and again, these changes were modest. They weren't, like, crazy, they just said, "Okay, let's reduce the great cabin by 6 feet so Cook could actually sleep in it, and let's
Okay.
remove one of the extra cabins for Banks's team." That was for the most part, the extent of the changes that they needed to make. But Banks now saw himself as a master mariner, right? He knows everything. And he was convinced that this was a plot, that the ship had been deliberately made heavy to crank her and sabotage his involvement. So he drives his carriage to Sheerness, which is where the
Of
port
course.
was with the ship, to inspect these renovations himself. And what followed, according to eyewitnesses, was just extraordinary. So John Elliott, our brutally honest 13-year-olds, remember that was there at the party, remembered Banks, quote, swore and stamped upon the wharf like a madman, throwing his weight around, ordering his servants and all his possessions off the ship immediately.
This is, this is one of the great tantrums of the 18th century, John.
Yeah, it really is. I love that it's documented by a 13-year-old
Oh
out there, man.
gosh.
So he so so Banks ends up lecturing Lord Sandwich, again, first
Okay,
lord of the Admiralty,
go on.
about ship construction,
Oh,
while making
wow.
it clear that he, Joseph Banks, was doing the world a favor by agreeing to go at all. And yet, interestingly, there seems to have been no real bad blood between Banks and Cook. Cook just carries on stoically while Banks is burning bridges, all around him. And Sandwich, ever the cool political operator, writes Banks a calm letter. He says, "Look, he's sorry that Banks had withdrawn, but please keep this in your head. Do not air your grievances in the public because uh, doing so was, a serious accusation, to suggest that the Navy would knowingly send men to sea in an unhealthy ship. That's not something you want to put out there."
Why would you do that, right? And which, of course, makes you wonder whether Banks was about to do exactly that, John.
Yeah,
That's
and Sam
even
obviously
funnier. Yeah.
yeah, Sandwich was obviously wondering the same thing, and you know what? He ends up actually being right, Patrick, because Banks ended up actually drafting a furious letter under the pseudonym Antarcticus, attacking those who had, quote, "so dirtily undermined him." Now, in the end, he did stop himself before sending it to newspapers, but only just. So that was a close call, at least in the eyes of the Navy. Now, the mission was still moving forward with or without Banks, and so the Royal Society had to move quickly. So Banks and his team end up getting replaced by Johann Reinhold Forster and his son George, who received the 4,000 pound government grant that Banks had wanted for Dr. Lind. And George was a young, popular guy. His father not so much. So we learned from during this voyage ultimately that the crew at various times actually threatened to throw the elder Forster overboard. And so you can only imagine the cook must have wished that Banks were there instead, even as a diva. Probably ended up being a little easier to deal with at the end.
Yeah. I mean, let's be real here, though, John. This is quite something. Okay. And I feel the story, I mean, has gone a different way. And it's really interesting just based how it's going so far, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think this is what anybody imagined, including Banks.
No, and so Banks is standing on the dock at Sheerness as the Resolution is sailing out without him, and he's
Yeah,
slowly
without him,
without him, and he's slowly realizing the scale of what he's done. Right, he'd thrown away this opportunity of a lifetime. He
the
died in
tantrum
South
comes full
Africa.
circle.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he could have been in Africa, but he isn't. But on his recommendation, the king had sent a Kew gardener, Francis Masson, who would end up actually collecting and sending back over 500 plant specimens to Banks. So, he would get to experience it in that way, I guess. But, this had also cost his employees 3 years' wages. And even Banks admitted ruefully that he had more money than sense. But this is the thing about Banks, right? He never stays down for long. He immediately begins looking for another voyage, another angle, and another way to advance science. And of course himself, right? He's
Of
still
course.
the center of his own world to a degree. So think Iceland, all right? Volcanoes, the East India Company. All of this is what's going to follow. And crucially, while he'd walk away from Cook's ship, he hadn't walked away from power because even as some mocked him, even as enemies circled, Banks was drawing closer and closer to the center of authority, making friends at court, advising the king, and quietly shaping Britain's plans really for the natural riches of the world.
Yeah, and that's right. So by the mid 1770s, right? Joseph Banks was now 30 years old,
Yeah.
which still feels faintly outrageous, right? Given where he's already landed, because quietly, um, almost without ceremony, he has become something Britain has never, I would say, really had before, a permanent scientific advisor to the king.
Yeah.
George III, Farmer George, as he liked to style himself, was only 5 years older than Banks, and the two men clicked. They shared an obsession with plants, agriculture, and improvement. This wasn't just courtly flattery, right, John? They walked together through royal gardens, taught crops and soils, new species, and old failures. By 1773, Banks could write with one characteristic understatement that he'd been given a kind of superintendence over the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, which is extraordinary phrase to say the least, isn't it? A kind of superintendence.
Yeah. That's doing a lot of work for 4 words.
It really is, because what it means is that Banks, still in his early 30s, is effectively running Q,
Yeah.
replacing John Stewart, the Earl of Bute, and turning what had been royal pleasure ground into something much more ambitious. So Peter Collinson, the great Quaker merchant and plant broker, called Q the paradise of our world, where all plants are found that money or interest can procure. And Banks takes that almost as a challenge. Because of him, Q isn't just about beauty, curiosity, it's infrastructure now. This garden, grown from a private plot on the Thames and cherished by the king's late mother, Princess Augusta, had already been shaped by a belief that plants mattered medicinally, economically, imperially. Augusta had founded a 4 hectare exotic garden devoted to medicinal plants, John.
Yeah.
Banks simply turbocharged the idea. He's deeply pragmatic. He doesn't collect plants for fun, not really, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
He collects them for use, drain the wetlands, improve the yield, feed the empire. He's already experimenting on these Lincolnshire estates, applying botany to agriculture, treating plants as tools for national improvement. I mean, come on. And now, with Q under his informal command, he sees something bigger. He wants every new plant discovered anywhere in the world to make its first appearance here at the Royal Botanic Gardens.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's basically globalization with flower beds. I mean, that's
100%. And yes,
literally, yeah,
Banks has the connections to make it all happen. East
yeah,
India Company traders, naval officers, colonial governors, all feeding specimens, seeds, and cutting back to Q. Colonies, in Banks' mind, are not just to rule, they're future agricultural engines,
yeah,
bread baskets, botanical experiments, John. So while his love life is causing raised eyebrows in London society, right? As we have heard in the previous episode when he called off his engagement,
yeah.
Banks himself is really unbothered. He's got thick skin and science still excites him far more than scandal. By 1774, he's invited into the Council of the Royal Society. He's everywhere now,
Yeah.
okay? Including and probably inside a room heated to over 200 degrees Fahrenheit, volunteering for experiments on how much heat the human body can survive. Solander lasts 5 minutes. Banks, fully clothed, sweats profusely, and lasts 7.
There's just it's something very Banksian about that.
Yeah. And there it is, really. It's stubborn, competitive, right? And a little crazy.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's it.
And then in July 1774, everything circles back to James Cook again. The adventure limps into Spithead first, right? Then on the 30th of July, Cook sails the Resolution home, triumph. One man lost out of 118.
Not bad.
Terra Australis decisively disproved, right? Hundreds
Mm,
of new plants and animals collected by forsters. And Banks keeps his head down because this is the voyage he famously stormed away from,
yeah.
the one he declared doomed to distress and disappointment. So he sends Solander ahead as a kind of emotional, right, reconnaissance mission.
Yeah.
Eventually, the message comes back. The coast is clear. Cook isn't angry. Banks swallows his pride. They dine together at the Royal Philosophers Club. The old warmth returns. Cook is elected unanimously as a fellow to the Royal Society. And soon enough, Cook is sailing again on the Resolution. But this time, Banks doesn't even try to go. He's done with years at sea. But he does make sure a Q Gardner goes instead. David Nelson, carefully contracted, paid £35 a year, and very explicitly instructed that every plant, every seed, and insect he collects belongs to Joseph Banks.
Yeah. He's learned from experience here, hasn't he? And this is not coming out of nowhere, this strict instructions.
No, very much so. Because remember the ownership of Parkinson's journals
Yeah.
that was challenged by his brother. And this third
Mm,
voyage, right, searching for the Northwest Passage, actually carries a future cast of characters too. A prickly young William Bligh, Charles Clerk, James Burney, even Benjamin Franklin, despite being the enemy now, quietly ensures French ships won't interfere.
mm.
Franklin, after all, was still a member of the Royal Society and friends of Banks.
There you go.
But Banks stays in London. He's busy with a publishing venture and looking for a new home, something bigger to house all his specimens. But he wasn't the only one in London tight on space. The city at this point is bursting. Poverty is rampant. Crime is endemic. Under the bloody code 222, crimes carry the death penalty. Many for acts of desperation like stealing a rabbit or cutting down a tree. Transportation had long been the alternative, specifically to North America, right?
Yeah.
But now America is gone. The prisons overflow. Hulks rot on the Thames, packed with convicts. At the same time, Britain's naval supply lines and under threat. Hemp, timber, tar, cut off by war and European alliances. And so inevitably, attention turns south to New Holland and to the man who knows it better than anyone alive. The government went to talk to who? Joseph
Oh,
Banks.
yeah.
These first serious discussions about settling New Holland happen just as Banks himself is settling down. He buys a grand house in Soho Square, builds his private academy of natural history, pours money into vast for the gym projects, and quietly gets engaged. Again, gets engaged. And we'll touch on that in just a bit later,
Yeah.
quietly. Okay. But his botanical vision of colonies as productive landscapes is now intersecting with a national crisis, which brings us to what happens next. Because very soon, banks will be asked to speak not just to the king, but to parliament itself.
Mhm.
And that is where Botany Bay becomes something far more dangerous and far more permanent.
That's right. Well, why don't we pause here? And when we come back after the break, we'll find out what other major life events Joseph Banks faces before he steps onto the floor of Parliament. Because by the time he speaks, Patrick, to these ministers of Parliament, he is a man with even more power and influence.
Yep.
We'll be right back. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the history of fresh produce. So, as we heard, things are moving in a nice direction for Banks. He's doing well for himself. He's gaining fame, power, influence, and now he is about to face parliaments. And so, by the autumn of 1778, Joseph Banks is now 35 years old, still relatively young. I think we keep saying that every time we mention his age. Maybe that's because he's still younger than us, Patrick. But anyway,
True.
he's already done something very few men of science could ever claim. He's explored more of the known world than almost anyone alive, and crucially, he's done it while becoming a close personal friend of the king. And that matters because this is the moment when Banks is about to step into one of the most powerful positions in British intellectual life, and that is the presidency of the Royal Society.
Yeah, it sure is, and which is not a small thing.
Now,
This is Newton's chair.
yeah, exactly. I mean, this is essentially the throne of British science. So think of Christopher Wren, Samuel Pepys, Isaac Newton, all former presidents of this society. And suddenly here's Joseph Banks, a man who's, again, it's worth stressing, hasn't actually published very much at all.
And that's always struck me as extraordinary too, right? He's famous, but not for papers. He's famous for having been places.
Yeah, I mean, it's very different, right? So he's a scientific celebrity rather
Oh my
than a
gosh, yes.
scientific author, right? He's like you said, he's been places. He hasn't actually like done experiments or anything really. And that all said, though, the timing for this is perfect. So the sitting president, Sir John Pringle, physician to the king, this grand old man of the Royal Society, has fallen spectacularly out of favor at court. And the reason? Lightning rods.
I know, right? Of course, that's the reason.
And I mean literal lightning rod. So Pringle supports Benjamin Franklin's preferred design, which are kind of what we know today when you think of lightning rods, right? These sharp spiked lightning rods which disperse, electrical charge. But
Yep.
English scientists, backed by the king, now favor rods with polite little knobs on the end. Now, Pringle refuses to budge. So when George III presses him, Pringle reportedly says, "Sire, I cannot reverse the laws and operation of nature," which is really an admirable statement, but also quite fatal.
Yeah, it's I would say this: never tell a king that nature outranks him.
No, that's at least not
Don't
these
do it.
days.
Don't do it.
So obviously, both parties are not going to budge on this, neither the king or Pringle. So Pringle ends up resigning, and suddenly there's a vacancy.
Yes,
And naturally, Banks is interested, right? Of course he is, Mr. Center of the world kind of
of
way of
course.
thinking. But Patrick, it's not a shoe-in because he has competition. So Alexander Aubert, this wealthy 49-year-old astronomer and head of the London Assurance Company. And this man, he's respectable, he's experienced, he's a safe choice. Pringle backs him. But Banks has something Aubert doesn't. That's popularity and the king's ear. After all, the Royal Society desperately needs royal patronage.
100%.
Global voyages, botanical expeditions, imperial science, none of that works without money and favor from the court. But there's actually one more thing Banks has, and that is his good old friend Daniel Solander. He's always there. He's behind the scenes. Solander's just quietly canvassing, and
Always.
Solander writes to Banks saying essentially, everyone's looking at you. You might not be hearing it, but everyone's looking at you. So six days later, another letter comes to Banks from Solander. He goes, "People are actively annoyed that Pringle is pushing Aubert. All talk of you," he tells Banks.
Of course, right? Of course, of course. And Solander as campaign manager, right?
Yeah, basically,
I mean,
he's
that's what it
he's
sounds like to me.
he's getting the lay of the land, trying to push him forward. Yeah. So now Banks does something very Banks-like. So he starts himself canvassing directly and discreetly. So no grand declarations, no ideological battles, just charm, dinners, conversations, handshakes. Again, it's not too dissimilar to what you see with politicians today, right? So he goes through this whole circus, and on the 30th of November, 1778, he wins, and Joseph Banks becomes president of the Royal Society.
And at age 35, let's note that.
Yes, at 35 again. And he'll actually remain in that chair for more than 40 years, Patrick. 40 years he'll remain in that.
Wow.
And so for the next 4 decades, if you want to know what British science thinks about anything, plants, animals, exploration, agriculture, Joseph Banks is the man. And he knows the weight of this position. Okay. So in his
Okay.
acceptance speech, Banks is careful, almost humble, which is not really a word we use very much with Banks. So he says he knows he can't match Newton's brilliance. Instead, he promises care, fairness, encouragement to all branches of science, even, he insists, without undue preference to his favorite study, botany, which is a promise, Patrick, he will, I would say, creatively interpret.
Well, botany is about to do very well, John.
It 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 definitely is
Right,
extraordinarily
yeah,
well.
extraordinary well.
So so 4 days later, Banks is presented to the king, not by the outgoing president, which is standard, but by Lord Sandwich, his pal. And it's a small detail, but an important one, and it just tells you exactly where power is flowing. And almost immediately, Banks uses that power because before he can even get married, his wedding to Dorothea is planned for March 1779. Again, we'll touch on a little bit on that marriage a little bit later. He's summoned to give evidence before Parliament, which is what we were talking about before we went to break. Now, remember, as we mentioned before we, we went to break, Britain has a problem, right? So its prisons are overflowing. The American colonies where convicts used to be sent are now in rebellion. The Thames, so, for our American listeners, the major river that flows through London is clogged with rotting prison hulks full of starving men and women. And so Parliament sets up a committee chaired by Sir Charles Bunbury to ask a grim question. What do we do with our criminals?
That's the question, and the answers are bleak.
Yeah. So the first witness is Duncan Campbell, and he's a merchant who's made a fortune transporting convicts. This is a business. And so he speaks with really horrifying frankness. He explains essentially the going rates for this convict transport business. So he says £10 for a male laborer, 8 or 9 for a woman, up to 25 for a skilled tradesman. The old and the infirm, worthless, although he did say that he tried to dispose of them with someone humane. Again, to 21st century ears, this sounds horrific to be talking about
Mm,
people this way.
just
Uh,
saying.
1 in 7 dies before or during the 2-month voyage, mainly from smallpox or what he called gold fever, which we'd recognize as typhus today. Then there was another witness that takes to the floor and suggests sending convicts to West Africa, to
Jeez.
Gambia. And their argument was, there's plenty of fruit, there's vegetables, timber. The local king apparently would be very happy to take white settlers, even if they're felons. And so all of this, I'm explaining kind of some of these testimonies because it's illustrating just how deeply transactional all of this is. This whole convict transportation business. It's human beings reduced to cargo. But then
Interesting.
Patrick Joseph Banks is called to the floor.
I was gonna say it's more and more. Here it comes, and ready. The room goes quiet.
It does, exactly. So this,
Right.
I mean, this is after all the president of the Royal Society, right? The throne of science, British science. And not only that, but friend of the king, a man who has seen more of the globe than anyone else in that room. So on the 10th of April, 1779, almost 9 years to the day since he stepped ashore there, Banks gives his verdict and he says, Botany Bay. Now, he acknowledges that he once thought New Holland was barren. And we heard that in whatever it was, part 2, I think, of the
Right.
series. Water was scarce, soil was poor, But he's reread Cook. He's reread Sidney Parkinson. He remembers fertile ground, mild climate, wild spinach growing thick, lawn, luxuriant grass. He describes lands with fish in abundance, timber for building, no beasts of prey, and crucially, space, right?
Right.
Vast empty space. And that's kind of important if you're moving convicts around. And he assures the committee that escape would be nearly impossible for these convicts, that sheep and oxen would thrive, that convicts after a year could feed themselves.
Yeah. I mean, it's getting better and better, but I don't know if it's I mean, let's and the people are already living there though, John?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an important piece of it, right?
I'm
This is
like,
not this is not some, like, empty land, right?
okay, just
But
checking.
and Banks knows this, but he dismisses them. He said, "Yeah,
Oh,
they're mere
yeah,
people,
100%.
they're cowardly, no serious opposition are expected with these people." And then comes the key moment. Banks is asked whether Britain would benefit from such colony. He replies that if settlers formed a civil government, that they would grow, they would trade and demand European goods, that a land larger than all of Europe would inevitably produce wealth. So that
Mm,
is the pivot, right? Banks isn't just describing a prison. He's describing a future agricultural empire, a scientific playground, a base for British power in the South Pacific.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes so much sense, and pretty much it makes sense of what's happening, but he's really planting an idea here,
Oh, yeah.
everyone.
One might say even the most productive
Oh my
CVs
gosh, yes.
ever handled. But Patrick, Parliament still needs laws, new laws, right? Nothing's going to happen overnight with this. But perception hasn't shifted. So New Holland is no longer worthless. It's no longer ignored. And yet, just as Banks reaches the absolute height of influence, loss begins to close in.
Yeah, and here we go. Here's the thing, John, is that you're so right because so it's let's say this. It's early 1780s, okay? And the grand scheme of Botany Bay, which Banks had argued for so passionately, is quietly shelved. And that is all thanks to the war with America.
Yep.
It's draining Britain dry in terms of ships, money, and attention. Okay. Now, convicts, instead of being shipped to the far side of the world, are kept close to home. They're dredging the Thames, hammering in posts to stop erosion, digging canals, throwing up walls around the royal arsenal at Woolwich. At one point, the government even toys with building a massive prison for 900 men just a few miles upriver from Westminster Bridge, John.
Yeah. So basically, I mean, Bonnie exists, Bonnie Bay exists at this stage, but more as a thought experiment than a destination.
I mean, exactly. It's an idea waiting for the right moment. And Banks, meanwhile, is changing too. His
Mhm.
own voyage through life begins to turn inward. Okay.
Yeah.
In March 1779, at the age of 36, the notorious playboy, the man who once would have dropped everything for a life at sea, gets married.
It gets hitched. There you go.
Dorothea Hutchinson. And almost overnight, Banks morphs into something very different, a stay put scientist, a respectable country squire. No more sailing off into danger himself.
No.
Now he travels by proxy, specimens, seeds, letters, reports. These flow into London from every corner of the globe, while Banks himself rarely strays beyond London or Lincolnshire. John.
Yeah. It actually feels very modern, right? I mean, this is the empire coming to him. It's the 18th century version of working remotely.
Yeah, it really does. And his house at Soho Square becomes the beating heart of this intellectual empire.
Yeah.
Plants everywhere, animals, curiosities from around the world. Living there too are his sisters, Sophia,
Mhm.
Dorothea's younger sister, Mary, and almost always Daniel Solander. Banks calls the women my ladies. Solander takes breakfast with them in the library. It's domestic, warm, and oddly collaborative.
Yeah.
Sophia Banks, in particular, is crucial. She never marries. She copies Joseph's journals, helps curate his private museum, even writes prayers for him. Banks likes to say he's an advocate for the natural rights of women, but in society that offers women precious few outlets, right?
Yeah.
So Sophia channels her intellect into advancing her brother's career.
Yeah,
Not
she's
bad.
really almost an invisible co-author of everything he does. That kind of invisible person in the background, but she's
Yeah.
doing a lot.
Very much so. And this household is open to anyone with a scientific bent. Rank doesn't matter. You get Irish Orientalists like William Marsden dropping in, astronomers, chemists, clergymen. Every Thursday morning, Banks hosts a public breakfast. Royal Society fellows, gentlemen, introduced by them, right? All crammed into Soho Square. It becomes the meeting place for Europe's thinkers. But then, in early 1780, a shadow falls. Disturbing reports begin to arrive from ships coming back from China, whispers, rumors, and Banks is at the center of the grim, right? Realization that his old friend James Cook is not coming home.
Oh,
And as we heard in earlier series we did on Hawaii, Cook was killed by the indigenous peoples of Hawaii.
that's right.
So by January, it's almost certain Cook is dead. Banks pushes hard for a pension for Cook's widow. He oversees motions at the Royal Society calling for a public act of appreciation. And soon the idea of a commemorative medal takes shape, the Royal Society Cook Medal.
Which I would say, Banks ends up buying in bulk.
He really does. Gold,
Yeah.
silver, bronze. He sends one to Cook's widow with a deeply personal note, mourning not just a national hero, but a friend. He even writes to Benjamin Franklin, remember, Britain and America are at war, thanking him for issuing instructions to protect Cook's ship. And Banks makes a point of saying, politics aside, philosopher to philosopher, the friendship stands. It's a revealing moment. Banks sees science as something that ought to float above war, even when the world stubbornly refuses to cooperate. Around the same time, he begins quietly canvassing support for a knighthood, an honor traditionally bestowed on Royal Society presidents. The prime minister raises it with the king, and on 23rd of March, 1781, Banks kisses the monarch's hand at St. James. He is now Sir Joseph Banks.
Yeah, not bad for the boy who once nearly froze to death chasing plants at the end of the world. Now an
Quite
official
right.
knight.
And the accolades keep coming. Leno's son names a genus after him, Boxia. Q is thriving. His house is buzzing with minds like William Herschel, fresh from discovering Uranus, Joseph Priestley talking chemistry and radical Christianity, Henry Cavendish explaining hydrogen, and always there translating, smoothing, connecting the continental visitors is Solander, round faced, brightly waistcoated, increasingly stout, but indispensable until suddenly he isn't. On the morning of the 8th of May of 1782, Banks is away when Solander collapses in the Soho Square house, mid conversation, recounting old expedition stories. A frantic message is sent. Banks travels all night to get home. London's best physicians attend to him, but nothing works. On the evening of the 13th of May, Solander dies at the age of 49 years old, a hemorrhage in the brain. Banks is devastated, devastated. He calls Solander irreplaceable. His grief spills out in writing stating that thinking of his friend causes such pain as makes a man shudder. This is not just a colleague. It was family to him, John.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge loss to Banks, and without Solander, I mean Banks, he really changes.
He does. With the great social lubricant gone, Banks becomes sharper, heavier, physically and metaphorically. As president of the Royal Society, he starts throwing his weight around. Critics accuse him of despotism, of favoring aristocrats, of tuning or turning the society into his private club. They sneer that he's trying to amuse the fellows with frogs, fleas, and grasshoppers. That real science, mathematics, Newton's legacy is being sidelined for plants and beetles. But Banks fires back. He talks darkly about equality as a monstrous birth. With revolution brewing in France, unrest at home, he sees hierarchy as a bulwark against chaos. The conflict erupts into what becomes known as the dissensions. Insults fly. Newton's editor declares science itself has been insulted by Banks' elevation. Banks, wounded but defiant, says he'll retire to his plow without a sigh if the fellows truly want him gone, though. So what happened? So a vote of confidence is made in January of 1784, and Banks survives comfortably. 119 in favor, 42 against. Even his critics concede something important. A man who keeps friends for decades cannot be a monster. Abrasive, yes. Dominating, perhaps, but loyal and still utterly central. And as Banks steadies himself after loss of Cook, of Solander, one idea, an old idea, begins quietly drifting back into view. That place he once championed, that distant harbor on the far side of the world. Botany Bay is about to re enter the conversation.
Yes, that's right. So Bonny Bay's back because by the early 1780s, Bonny Bay again had been a curious status in the British imagination, right? It wasn't a place anyone had seen for more than a decade, and yet it just keeps resurfacing like a half remembered dream,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
floating in and out the whole time. And the reason it kept coming back into that conversation was in large part Joseph Banks, or rather the launch shadow of Joseph Banks. Because back in England, another figure from Cook's first voyage was growing restless, and that was James Matra. So Matra had actually wandered the shores of New South Wales with Banks some 13 years earlier, and he was now home from a deeply disappointing stint in New York. So the American Revolution had ended. Britain, of course, had lost the colonies, and Matra, which was a loyalist, found himself with no country and no prospects. And so in July 1783, Matra wrote to Banks. He'd heard rumors, he said, of plans to settle Botany Bay. Could Banks tell him more? After all, Matra assumed quite reasonably that if such a colony were to exist, it would be under Banks's direction because who else would it be, right?
So this is less wide-eyed exploration now and more imperial job application.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, Matra ends
Okay.
up describing himself as living the life of a solitary fugitive, and he apparently thought often of New South Wales. And frankly, he'd rather throw in his lot with a speculative settlement at the far end of the world than accept anything else on offer in the northern hemisphere. So he just clearly wants out of this region of the world. But this wasn't just about personal survival. So Matra began thinking strategically, imperially. Britain had lost America. Perhaps it could regain its footing elsewhere. Perhaps New South Wales could become not just a consolation prize, but something far more ambitious. So in August 1783, Matra fired off a document with a wonderfully direct title, Patrick, which was a proposal for establishing a settlement in New South Wales.
Hmm.
Not mincing words here. And he ends up sending this straight to the coalition government led by Lord North and Charles Fox. New South Wales, he argued, was the most inviting, distant territory Britain possessed. Cook had chartered 2,000 miles of the coastline and had given it, quote, the most favorable account. Right? So we talked about this. The land offered every variety of soil. Indigenous inhabitants were, in his telling, very few. And with good management, just 20 or 30 years, it could, Matra claimed, cause a revolution in the whole system of European commerce.
Listen, we this is remarkable, okay? Because there's a confident thing to say about somewhere you'd barely scratch the surface of,
Yeah,
right? I
right.
mean,
I
that's
mean,
pretty confident to say the least.
yeah, not to mention it's also been over a decade since you last saw the place.
I'm just saying.
But it is revealing, right? Because Matra imagines New South Wales as perfectly placed for trade with Japan, China, even Korea, regions he described as largely unvisited by Europeans.
Yep.
The climate, he said, matched that of the Spice Islands, and that it was ideal for things like sugar, tea, coffee, cotton, indigo, tobacco, and crucially, that all crops, I mean, that essentially it would be for all crops that underpinned global power. And again, Matra dropped in a familiar name. Sir Joseph Banks, he insisted, highly approves of the settlement. Banks would gladly advise the ministry whenever required. Banks this, Banks that. And so the proposal itself focused on resettling American loyalists, men like Matra himself, cast out of the new United States. But when the new Home Secretary, Lord Sidney, responded, he gently redirected the idea, right? And so anyone that knows American history or British history in that period knows that Canada would be the one to take the loyalists. And that's what Lord Sydney said would happen. That was the intention, that the loyalists would just be moved to Canada. Botany Bay, however, might be something else entirely. It might be, Sydney ends up suggesting, quote, a very proper region for the reception of criminals.
Ah, and there it is.
That's right. So Matra quickly adjusts. Okay, he says, "Okay, that's what you want. All right, let me rewrite my
That's what you
proposal.
want?
Yeah, let me just change a few words in this." So, in his amended proposal in April 1784, he argued that New South Wales was far safer as a penal colony than Africa. He pointed to the grim statistics from the Gambia, hundreds dead, hundreds vanished. Botany Bay, by contrast, offered soil, climate, and distance. And again, distance mattered because, as we already heard several times now, Britain has this crisis, right? Prison hulks are clogging the Thames, convicts are piling up, nowhere to go. So, in March 1785, Edmund Burke demanded to know in Parliament what was going to be done with these, quote, unhappy wretches, and pointedly, whether they were really being sent to Gambia where, quote, all life dies and all death lives. And
Yeah.
so, on that point, a select committee is
On that
formed,
point.
and suddenly Botany Bay was no longer a speculative dream. This was turning into a practical solution. So on the 9th of May, the committee asks Sumatra a very specific question. Could 300 or 400 convicts be sent to New South Wales and through hard labor, provided with proper tools and seeds, make a settlement that could support itself? And Matra's answer is yes. 500 even, if the guards stay. And so he of course volunteers to lead the expedition himself. Governor Matra, after all, has a nice ring to it. And he asks for Marines, a 40-gun ship, military law, clergy to maintain order, and seeds and livestock to be picked up along the way at the Cape, Madagascar, the Moluccas. It's an entire ecosystem imagined in advance. And then, of course, to the party, Joseph Banks is called up.
And this is where his words really start to matter.
Oh, 100%. Because on the 10th of May, Banks appears before this committee and is asked the central question. Could convicts be sent somewhere where by labor they might support themselves? And his answer was calm, it was precise, and really devastatingly persuasive. He had absolutely no doubt that large stretches of the eastern coast of New South Wales were fertile enough to support a considerable European population using ordinary English methods of cultivation. And so Banks says that Bonny Bay was, in quote, every respect adapted to the purpose. Now, he admitted what he didn't know. So, Aboriginal languages, systems of government, but he emphasized what he did know. So, fish were plentiful. There were no dangerous wild beasts. Timber was suitable for houses and ships. European cattle would thrive. Grains and legumes would grow. The climate was analogous to Europe. And then he delivered the line, Patrick, that seals it. From the fertility of the soil, the climate, and what he described as the timid disposition of the inhabitants, he gave Botany Bay the preference over every other place he had seen. Remember, this is coming from a man that has literally been around the world. Africa, however, was still cheaper. So Parliament makes one final attempt at Africa to see if truly they can't make that work. So Lord Sydney sends a squadron to investigate a possible African site. And, long story short, it's a complete disaster. The commander of that expedition dies of fever. No suitable harbors found. And when that expedition limps back to England in July of 1786, the decision is effectively made. Africa is out. Botany Bay suddenly becomes something else entirely. It's no longer a botanical curiosity. It's no longer a footnote in Cook's voyage. This site becomes the answer. And so on the 18th of August, 1786, Lord Sydney informs the Treasury that His Majesty has decided Botany Bay it would be. So orders go out to prepare a fleet. And though the instructions didn't bear, Banks' signature, he's not involved in the details of all this, they carry his unmistakable fingerprints,
Yeah.
soil, seeds, climate, cultivation. That's
Yeah.
all Banks.
So a place first described through plants is now about to be built through them.
Exactly. So Botany Bay had re-entered the conversation not as an idea, but as a destination,
Destination.
right?
Yeah.
And so in the next episode of our series here, we're going to follow what happens when that vision collides with the reality. When the ships arrive, the convicts disembark, and New
Uh-oh.
Holland begins not on paper, but in the dirt.
Yeah, in the dirt, baby.
Because again, imagining the colony is one thing, but trying to grow one, that is something else entirely.
Yeah. Everyone, what a cliffhanger. So if listeners want to head over to Australia right away and be on the very first experience in this new land, all they need to do is join our Royal Society in the
Mhm.
History of Fresh Produce Club. You can go on our website, the app the Produce Industry Podcast, click on support, and you'll see the membership. So check those out, and we want to see you all time, all access, all listening.
That's right. It's your chance for a one-way ticket to Australia at a very affordable price, mind you.
Yeah.
But if you prefer to take the clunker ship that's going to be delayed a week, you can, of course, do that. No
I'll
judgment
see
at
you in a
all.
week or so.
We will just wait for you calmly in Australia until then. So until next time, it's goodbye for me, John Papp.
And goodbye for me, Patrick Kelly.